At 08:45 hours on February 22, 1945, 437 Allied bombers appeared over the Ruhr Valley in western Germany. The formation included RAF heavy bombers, American B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators. The targets were synthetic oil plants, transportation choke points, and industrial facilities clustered in a 50-mile radius around Essen, Dortmund, Duisburg, and Bochum. The raid was the beginning of a 6-week campaign that would destroy Germany's industrial heartland completely. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, was in his Berlin office when the reports arrived. The Ruhr was under massive attack, all targets, simultaneous strikes, transportation paralyzed, coal mines hit, steel plants burning, power generation disrupted. Speer immediately understood the implications. The Ruhr produced 60% of Germany's steel, 50% of Germany's coal, much of Germany's ammunition, weapons, and industrial equipment. Without the Ruhr, German war production would collapse within weeks. What Speer could not understand was why the Allies had waited until February 1945 to launch this campaign. The Ruhr had been within range of Allied bombers since 1940, for over 4 years, while Allied bombers hit Berlin, Hamburg, cities across Germany. While they bombed ball-bearing plants and oil refineries and transportation networks, they had mostly bypassed the Ruhr. Now, with Germany already defeated strategically, with Soviet forces approaching from the east and Allied forces approaching from the west, the Allies finally attacked the one target that could have ended the war years earlier. Speer later testified that sustained attacks on the Ruhr beginning in 1943 would have collapsed German production by autumn of that year. The war would have ended in 1944 instead of 1945. Hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved. The Holocaust would have been shortened. Eastern Europe would not have endured an additional year of occupation and destruction, all because Allied strategic bombing doctrine had focused on the wrong targets for 4 years. The Ruhr Valley was Germany's industrial foundation. The region stretched approximately 50 miles east to west and 30 miles north to south, encompassing dozens of cities and industrial centers. Before the war, the Ruhr produced 78% of Germany's coal, 69% of Germany's crude steel, and much of Germany's machinery, chemicals, and industrial equipment. It was the largest industrial concentration in Europe, possibly in the world. The region's geography made it ideal for heavy industry. Coal deposits lay close to the surface, easily mined. The Rhine River and its tributaries provided water transportation. Railways connected the region to all of Germany. The population was dense, providing workforce for factories. Centuries of industrial development had concentrated steel mills, coal mines, chemical plants, machine tool factories, and weapons production in a relatively small area. Germany's war machine depended entirely on Ruhr production. Steel for tanks, ships, aircraft, coal for power generation, transportation, and chemical processes, explosives and ammunition manufactured in Ruhr plants, heavy machinery built in Ruhr factories, artillery pieces forged in Ruhr foundries. If the Ruhr stopped producing, Germany stopped fighting. The dependency was absolute. Allied planners knew this. British intelligence had detailed information about Ruhr industry dating back to the 1920s. American intelligence gathered additional information after 1941. Every major factory was mapped, production capacities were documented, transportation networks were analyzed. Allied planners knew exactly where Germany's industrial heart was located and exactly how vulnerable it was to strategic bombing. The Ruhr was also within easy range of Allied bombers. The western edge of the Ruhr was only 180 miles from Allied air bases in England. RAF Bomber Command could reach the Ruhr in less than 90 minutes. Fighter escorts could accompany bombers all the way to targets and back. Weather over the Ruhr was frequently poor, but no worse than weather over other German targets. From a purely tactical perspective, the Ruhr was the most accessible major industrial target in Germany. Yet Allied bombers bypassed the Ruhr for years. Why? The answer involved strategic doctrine, inter-service rivalry, technological limitations, and fundamental misunderstanding of how to cripple industrial economies. The story began in 1940 when RAF Bomber Command started its strategic bombing campaign against Germany. Air Marshal Arthur Harris took command of RAF Bomber Command in February 1942. Harris believed in area bombing, destroying German cities to kill industrial workers, destroy worker housing, break civilian morale, and disrupt industrial production. His doctrine held that precision attacks on specific factories were inefficient. Factories could be repaired, workers could be replaced, but destroying entire cities created permanent disruption. Harris's strategy focused on burning German cities. Incendiary bombs created firestorms that killed tens of thousands of civilians and destroyed square miles of urban areas. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, dozens of other cities were subjected to area bombing. The raids killed approximately 400,000 German civilians and destroyed 3.6 million homes. The devastation was enormous. But German industrial production increased through 1944 despite the bombing. Albert Speer reorganized German industry efficiently. Factories were dispersed, production was moved underground, damaged facilities were repaired quickly. Worker morale, while damaged, did not break. German workers kept producing weapons even while their homes burned. Harris stubbornly insisted area bombing would eventually work if conducted with sufficient intensity. He resisted diverting bombers to other targets. When asked to attack specific industrial targets, Harris often ignored the orders or executed them half-heartedly. His focus remained on burning cities. The Ruhr cities, Essen, Dortmund, Duisburg, Bochum were bombed as part of this campaign, but the attacks targeted residential areas and city centers, not the industrial facilities themselves. American doctrine was different. The United States Army Air Forces believed in precision daylight bombing of specific industrial targets. Destroy the factories, destroy production. The theory was logical, but execution was difficult. The Norden bomb site was accurate under ideal conditions, but rarely encountered ideal conditions. Weather, clouds, smoke, flak, and fighter attacks degraded accuracy significantly. Many bombs missed their targets by hundreds of yards. American planners identified several critical target systems. Ball bearings were one. Germany needed ball bearings for all mechanical equipment tanks, aircraft, vehicles, machinery. Destroy ball bearing production, and all German production would collapse. The theory was elegant. The execution was disastrous. The most famous attack was the Second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943. 291 B-17 bombers attacked ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt. German fighters shot down 60 bombers, over 20% of the attacking force. 600 American airmen died or were captured. The raid damaged ball-bearing production but did not destroy it. German engineers substituted simpler bearings in non-critical applications. Imports from Sweden and Switzerland increased. Within months, ball-bearing production recovered. The raid was a costly failure. Another target system was aircraft production. Destroy German aircraft factories, and the Luftwaffe would wither. But German aircraft factories were dispersed across Germany and occupied territories. Attacking them required deep penetration missions into heavily defended airspace. Losses were severe, and German production continued increasing through 1944 despite sustained attacks on aircraft plants. The debate over target selection became bitter. Harris wanted to continue area bombing. American commanders like General Karl Spaatz wanted to attack oil production. Some planners wanted to attack transportation networks. Others wanted to focus on specific industries like ball bearings or chemicals. The competing theories were never fully resolved. Different commanders pursued different strategies, often simultaneously, sometimes contradicting each other. The Ruhr was discussed repeatedly but never prioritized. The reasons varied depending on who was arguing. Harris believed area bombing of German cities was more effective than attacking industrial targets. Since Ruhr cities were already being bombed, he saw no need to focus specifically on Ruhr industry. American planners initially believed ball bearings in aircraft production were more critical than steel. By the time they recognized oil was the key target in 1944, resources were committed to the oil campaign. There was also a belief that attacking the Ruhr was redundant. German production was already being disrupted by attacks on other targets. Coal production in the Ruhr required little bombing because coal mines were difficult targets underground, dispersed, easily repaired. Steel plants required continuous production. Shutting them down was difficult. Better to attack the end products like tanks and aircraft than the basic materials like steel. This reasoning was fundamentally wrong, but it dominated Allied thinking through 1943 and much of 1944. German production records captured after the war revealed the errors clearly. Speer's ministry kept detailed production statistics. The records showed that German steel production remained remarkably stable through 1944 despite years of Allied bombing. Germany produced 28.7 million tons of steel in 1940. Production increased to 31.8 million tons in 1941. In 1942, despite RAF area bombing campaign, production reached 32.1 million tons. In 1943, production was 30.6 million tons, slightly down, but still adequate. In 1944, production was 25.8 million tons, reduced but still sufficient for weapons production. The stability demonstrated that Allied bombing was not significantly affecting steel production. Ruhr factories continued operating. Coal continued being mined. Steel continued being produced. Germany had excess steel capacity. Even with production reduced by 20% in 1944, Germany could still produce all the steel needed for weapons. But the statistics also revealed vulnerability. German steel production was geographically concentrated. Approximately 60% came from the Ruhr. Another 15% came from Upper Silesia. The remaining 25% came from scattered plants. If the Ruhr's production had been eliminated, German steel output would have dropped to 40% of normal. That would have been catastrophic. Steel shortages would have cascaded through German industry. Tank production required steel for armor and hulls. Aircraft production required steel for frames and engines. Ship production required enormous steel quantities. Artillery, trucks, railroad cars, submarines, everything required steel. A 60% reduction in steel availability would have reduced weapons production by similar amounts within months. Speer testified after the war that eliminating Ruhr steel production would have been immediately catastrophic for German war production. He stated that Germany had no way to replace Ruhr steel quickly. Other production centers could not increase output fast enough. Imports from occupied territories were already maximized. Stockpiles existed, but would be exhausted within 3 to 4 months of sustained shortage. Speer was asked specifically when concentrated attacks on the Ruhr would have been most effective. He answered that attacks in 1943 would have had maximum impact. By 1943, German production was stretched thin, weapons production was increasing, but margin for error was minimal. Losing 60% of steel production in 1943 would have collapsed German weapons output by late 1943 or early 1944. Germany could not have continued offensive operations. The war would have ended. But in 1943, Allied bombers were attacking ball bearings, aircraft factories, and cities. The Ruhr was bombed sporadically as part of area bombing campaigns, but industrial facilities were not systematically targeted. Steel plants continued operating. Coal mines continued producing. The opportunity was missed. The critical insight from German records was that steel production was the bottleneck, not ball bearings, which could be substituted, not aircraft, which could be dispersed, not even oil initially, though oil became critical in 1944. Steel was the foundation of everything. Without steel, nothing else mattered. Germany could have all the oil, aluminum, and chemicals in the world without steel. Those materials were useless. But Allied planners did not fully appreciate this until late in the war. The focus on precision bombing of specific high-value targets, ball bearings, aircraft factories, distracted from the reality that destroying basic industrial capacity was more effective than destroying specialized production. The Ruhr's transportation infrastructure was even more vulnerable than production facilities. The region was connected to the rest of Germany by railways and the Rhine River. Coal moved by rail and barge, steel moved by rail, raw materials moved by rail, finished weapons moved by rail. Everything depended on transportation. The railway system in the Ruhr was dense but had choke points. Major rail yards at Hamm, Schwerte, and Soest handled most traffic. Railway bridges crossed the Rhine and Ruhr rivers at specific points, destroy the bridges and rail yards, and the Ruhr's production became useless. Steel could be produced but not transported. Coal could be mined but not moved. The entire industrial region would be isolated. Allied planners understood this theoretically, but did not act on it until very late. Transportation attacks began in earnest in autumn 1944 as part of the transportation plan designed to disrupt German logistics before D-Day and afterward. Bridges and rail yards were hit repeatedly. The attacks were effective but came too late to shorten the war significantly. Post-war analysis revealed that systematic transportation attacks on the Ruhr in 1943 combined with attacks on steel production would have been devastating. German production would have collapsed. Speer estimated that sustained transportation attacks isolating the Ruhr from the rest of Germany would have halved German weapons production within 2 months. Combined with attacks on Ruhr steel plants, production would have dropped to perhaps 30% of previous levels. That would have been unsurvivable. The question remains, why did Allied planners miss this? Several factors contributed. First, bombing accuracy was poor until late in the war. Early bombing raids were lucky to put bombs within a mile of targets. Even with Norden bomb sites and improved training, accuracy remained problematic through 1943. Attacking dispersed transportation targets required precision that often did not exist. By 1944, accuracy had improved through better training, better equipment, and better tactics. But by then, Germany was already losing. Second, strategic bombing doctrine was immature. The RAF and USAF were pioneering strategic bombing during the war. No one had done this before. Theories about what to bomb were untested. Ball bearings seemed logical as a bottleneck. Aircraft factories seemed obvious. Cities seemed like they would break morale. These theories seemed reasonable, but proved wrong or inefficient in practice. Third, inter-service rivalry impeded coordination. RAF Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force operated independently with different doctrines. Harris pursued area bombing. American commanders pursued precision attacks. Coordination was minimal. Combined attacks on single target systems were rare. The lack of unified strategy meant resources were dispersed across multiple competing priorities instead of concentrated on the most effective targets. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Allied planners underestimated German resilience and adaptability. They believed that bombing ball-bearing plants would cripple production. It did not. Germany adapted. They believed that destroying cities would break morale. It did not. Germans kept working. They believed that dispersed attacks on aircraft factories would reduce production. Production increased. Allied assumptions about German vulnerabilities were often wrong because they underestimated German capacity to repair damage, substitute materials, and reorganize production. But the one vulnerability Germany could not overcome was loss of basic industrial capacity. Factories could be dispersed, but steel production could not. Coal mines were geographically fixed. Steel plants required enormous infrastructure blast furnaces, rolling mills, power generation that could not be quickly rebuilt if destroyed. The Ruhr was irreplaceable. When systematic attacks on the Ruhr finally began in February 1945, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The campaign was called Operation Clarion. Over 10,000 bomber sorties were flown against Ruhr targets in 6 weeks. Steel plants were hit repeatedly. Coal mines were attacked. Rail yards were destroyed. Bridges were dropped. The Rhine River bridges that carried supplies into the Ruhr were systematically demolished. German production statistics showed the impact clearly. Steel production in the Ruhr dropped to 20% of January 1945 levels by March. By April, production had essentially ceased. Coal production declined similarly. Transportation was paralyzed. Nothing could move in or out of the Ruhr. The region's industries stopped functioning. Germany's total weapons production collapsed simultaneously. Tank production in March 1945 was 25% of January levels. Aircraft production dropped by 40%. Ammunition production declined by 50%. The collapse was not just from Ruhr-attack Soviet advances, fuel shortages, and general disintegration all contributed. But the Ruhr attacks were the final blow that made continued production impossible. Speer reported to Hitler in late March that Germany could no longer produce sufficient weapons to continue fighting. The Ruhr was lost. Silesian industry was in Soviet hands. The remaining German industry could not sustain military operations. Hitler ignored the report and ordered continued resistance. But the industrial reality was final. Germany surrendered 6 weeks later because, among other reasons, it could no longer produce weapons. Post-war interrogations of German industrial managers revealed unanimous assessment earlier attacks on the Ruhr would have ended the war sooner. The managers testified that the Ruhr's vulnerability was understood within German leadership. Speer had warned repeatedly that sustained Allied attacks on Ruhr transportation and steel production would be catastrophic. Göring dismissed the concerns, insisting German air defenses would prevent concentrated attacks. By the time Göring was proved wrong, it was too late to matter strategically. The Allied strategic bombing campaign is often assessed as marginally effective or ineffective until late in the war. German production increased through 1944. Cities were destroyed, but morale did not break. Precision attacks on ball bearings and aircraft factories had limited impact. The campaign killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and 80,000 Allied aircrew, but did not clearly shorten the war until 1945. But the assessment misses the key point. The campaign targeted the wrong objectives for too long. Ball bearings, aircraft factories, and cities were not Germany's Achilles heel. The Ruhr was basic industrial capacity. Steel, coal, transportation was the vulnerability that could not be substituted or dispersed. Attacks on the Ruhr in 1943 would have collapsed German production when Germany was already stretched thin. The cost of the delay was measurable. The war in Europe lasted until May 1945. If sustained Ruhr attacks had begun in 1943, German production would have collapsed by late 1943 or early 1944. The war might have ended in 1944. That would have saved hundreds of thousands of military casualties in 1944 and 1945, tens of thousands of Allied bomber crew casualties. Continuation of the Holocaust through 1944 and 1945, Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe extending farther west, the Battle of the Bulge and its 90,000 American casualties. The destruction of German cities in late 1944 and 1945, Soviet atrocities during the occupation of Eastern Germany. The counterfactual cannot be proven definitively. But German production records, Speer's testimony, and post-war analysis all support the conclusion that earlier Ruhr attacks would have shortened the war significantly. The strategic lesson was clear, but learned too late. In industrial warfare, basic production capacity matters more than specialized products. Destroying steel is more effective than destroying tanks, because steel is required for everything and cannot be substituted. Destroying transportation is more effective than destroying individual factories because transportation cannot be dispersed. The Ruhr combined both vulnerabilities. It was concentrated steel production entirely dependent on rail and river transportation. Allied planners were not incompetent. They were operating with incomplete understanding of industrial warfare. Strategic bombing was new. Theories about target selection were untested. Mistakes were inevitable, but the mistakes were costly. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial Achilles heel, obvious in retrospect, knowable at the time with proper analysis, but not prioritized until too late to significantly shorten the war. Harris's area bombing campaign killed civilians, but did not break German morale or cripple production. American precision bombing attacked targets that Germany could replace or substitute. The oil campaign in 1944 was effective, but came after Germany was already losing. The transportation campaign worked but was not sustained early enough. The Ruhr campaign destroyed German industry, but only after Germany was already defeated strategically. The Allied strategic bombing campaign ultimately succeeded. Germany's war economy collapsed, industrial production ceased, transportation paralyzed, but success came through trial and error, with enormous cost in time, lives, and resources. The campaign that worked systematic destruction of basic industrial capacity in the Ruhr began 58 months after the war started. Earlier focus on the Ruhr would have achieved the same result years faster. Speer's final assessment was damning in his interrogations, in his memoirs, in multiple statements after the war. He consistently stated that Allied attacks on the Ruhr were Germany's most feared bombing scenario throughout the war. He had prepared contingency plans for dispersing some production, but knew that losing Ruhr steel would be catastrophic. The attacks never came systematically until 1945, when they no longer mattered strategically. The irony was complete. The Allies' most effective industrial target was bombed last. The target that could have shortened the war was bypassed for years. The vulnerability that German leadership feared most was exploited only after Germany was already defeated. The strategic debate between targeting oil versus transportation versus industry was resolved by attacking all three in 1944-1945. But the most effective target the Ruhr's industrial capacity received sustained attention only at the war's end. German production records captured in 1945 and analyzed afterward revealed the full extent of the missed opportunity. The Ruhr produced components for virtually every German weapon system. Tiger tanks used steel armor plate from Ruhr mills. U-boats used steel hulls from Ruhr foundries. Locomotives used steel boilers from Ruhr plants. Artillery pieces were forged in Ruhr facilities. Everything traced back to Ruhr steel and Ruhr coal. Sustained attacks beginning in 1943 would have created cascading failures across German industry. Tank production would have stopped within months as steel allocations ran out. Aircraft production would have slowed as aluminum production declined due to power shortages. Ammunition production would have ceased as chemical plants lost coal supplies. The Wehrmacht would have run out of everything simultaneously. But in 1943, Allied bombers were attacking Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants and Hamburg's residential districts. The Ruhr continued producing. German industry continued functioning. The war continued another 24 months beyond when it might have ended. The cost was incalculable. The Ruhr Valley was Germany's industrial Achilles heel. Allied planners knew its location and its importance. Allied bombers could reach it easily from 1940 onward. The strategic insight that destroying basic industrial capacity was more effective than attacking end products was available through analysis. But strategic bombing doctrine, inter-service rivalry, and focus on other targets delayed systematic Ruhr attacks until February 1945, when they no longer mattered. The result was one of the great missed opportunities of World War II. The target that could have shortened the war was bombed last. The vulnerability that could have collapsed German production was exploited only after Germany was already defeated. The industrial heart of German war production kept beating while Allied bombers attacked less critical targets. When the Ruhr was finally destroyed in spring 1945, it validated what German leaders had feared for 5 years: attacks on the Ruhr were unsurvivable. The attacks just came too late to matter.